While most presidents wore suit jackets, ties, and dress pants all the time, you don't have to any longer. Because Presidents Unplugged has merch. If you want to check out some new shirts to buy as a nice gift for somebody in your family or just something that you want yourself, go to presidentsunpluggedmerch.com to check out new shirts, hoodies, crew necks, and anything else that you can dream of. Now in many more colors and new designs coming soon. I'm very excited for the Presidents Unplugged merch store to finally be open. Now, let's get back to the show. On July 2nd, 1881, inside of a Washington, D.C. train station, a man was preparing to board a train to go to a college reunion, when suddenly, 2 shots rang out and silenced the bustling crowd. Both bullets struck James Garfield, our 20th U.S. president. Welcome to week 2 of the spooky month of assassinations. This week, we're not talking about attempts. We're talking about a real assassination. We're diving into the story of President James A. Garfield, his life, his mind, and how a slow, painful tragedy followed what should have really been a survivable injury. Let's do this. Even though most of this episode is going to be talking about Garfield's assassination, I quickly want to look over who he really was. Garfield was one of the most intelligent men that ever was in the White House. He was ambidextrous, meaning that he could write with both hands. Now, that doesn't automatically make you a genius. That one girl in 3rd grade that was flexing it, yeah, you're not that special. But James Garfield was. And he loved journaling. And he didn't just journal about what he was doing that day. James Garfield journaled about ways he could fix the country and often quoted people like Shakespeare. And as a kid who has tried to read Romeo and Juliet, a person who can quote Shakespeare correctly is a pretty smart guy. James Garfield used this intellect that he had in great ways, especially when he became president. He became president in a time when America was extremely divided. And I'm not just saying divided Republicans, Democrats. The Republicans, the party that he was a part of, were split on a big thing called the spoils system. And I'm not talking about the spoiling milk in the back of your fridge. The spoils system is a way that loyal supporters of a political party would be given jobs in politics as sort of a reward for their help in a campaign or a political mission. Now, that might sound good, like, okay, they're a good supporter, so it makes sense we'd put them in position. But just because you were on the campaign trail, just because you made a couple of speeches, does not mean you're a good politician. The spoils system was so difficult for people to understand that it actually divided the Republican Party into 2. Garfield had fought in the Civil War, and he supported Abraham Lincoln to the very end. He saw Reconstruction, and he wanted to unify this fractured country. And the spoils system, it was breaking people apart. It was making people who had helped in campaigns say, "Oh, give me this job because I did this for you." It was chaos, and it separated people even more than they already were. And let's just say, the Civil War was extremely divided. But through division, James Garfield didn't pick a side and run with it like we do today often. Garfield did something different. Garfield wanted to be a unifier, one that brought people together and didn't look at those little divisions. All he wanted to do was fix the fractured country that the Civil War had created and make us remember the fact that we're all Americans. And Garfield was very good at it. He was a peacemaker. And really, he seems like the last man who would be targeted in an assassination attempt. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. See you there. But then came the man of the chaos, Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau started off as he was a little crazy. He was a little delusional. He was pretty unstable. But he actually started off doing something that is pretty normal. He campaigned for Garfield. Did he campaign well for Garfield? No. He got up on stage and made a couple of jumbled speeches that didn't really say anything important. And he would constantly go up to Garfield and say, "Look what I did for you. Oh my gosh, I made these great speeches that moved a lot of people towards you." Even though they didn't. These were not good speeches, y'all. And Charles Guiteau came up to Garfield in the midst of the spoils system debate. Guiteau had campaigned for Garfield pretty much. Supposedly made people go his way, even though he didn't. And Guiteau wanted a job in government. Garfield was not going to give Guiteau a place in government. Just because he made a speech does not mean he would get a position in government, especially because he was a little jumbled up in the head. When Garfield didn't reward him with a position that he thought he deserved, Guiteau's obsession turned a little dark. He began stalking Garfield, even following his wife at one point. Let me just give you a little idea, guys. Don't follow somebody's wife. It will not end well. He knew Garfield was a good guy, but in his twisted mind, that didn't even matter. On July 2nd, after stalking Garfield's way through the news and the press, he knew that Garfield would be in a Washington, D.C. train station. Guiteau pulled out a pistol that later he claimed he chose because it would look good in a museum. Yeah, this guy was not a good guy. And he fired the gun twice. Chaos broke out. Garfield collapsed on the ground. Guiteau was quickly arrested, and he was smiling and declaring really loud, "I am a stalwart," basically a person who supports the spoils system, and Arthur is now president. Now, who was Arthur? Chester Arthur, James Garfield's vice president. Now, obviously, it wasn't fully declared until the 25th Amendment made it fully clear, but the vice president becomes the president if the president's assassinated. And Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland actually did disagree on the spoils system. Arthur believed in it, but James Garfield did not. So that's something they disagreed on. And after James Garfield made a decision that disagreed with the spoils system, the vice president who agreed with the spoils system would become president, also known as conspiracy theories. Now, I gotta make this clear. Conspiracy theories nowadays are you're scrolling on social media and see something that's linked to something and you're like, "Oh my gosh, we didn't land on the moon." It wasn't really like that. Conspiracy theories didn't exist back then. The conspiracy theory that would have existed if they had social media back then was Chester Arthur killed James Garfield. That would be the conspiracy theory. But it didn't really happen like that. People didn't put two and two together. In the end, I don't think Chester Arthur was behind it at all, but it was interesting to see how Guiteau said this, because it makes Chester Arthur, the person who became president after Garfield died, looked really, really bad. And as all this conspiracy action and Guiteau yelling out all this stuff, Garfield was rushed back to the White House. He was wounded pretty greatly, but he was still alive. And here's where the tragedy really deepens, not because of the bullets, but because of the great medicine of the time. That is obviously sarcasm. The doctors that were called to the White House to help him were considered the, quote, best doctors in the country. Yet they ignored the new medical knowledge that was coming out at the time about sterilization, how germs maybe might exist. They repeatedly probed Garfield's wounds with their bare, unwashed fingers, searching for that bullet. Now, let me make this very clear. If my doctor starts playing in one of my wounds with his dirty finger, I'm going to get an infection. These doctors didn't even think about that in that time. They didn't even know germs existed. They didn't even have germ theory. So, if you can guess, they were so locked in to find this bullet, they didn't even care that James Garfield had just gotten a major infection because of their fingers. That is probably the reason he died. And they weren't focused on the infection. They were focused on finding the bullet. And this is just, there's two really cool facts about Garfield's kind of time before he died. One of them was that to find this bullet, because they were so focused on finding the bullet, they called in their old buddy Alexander Graham Bell, the creator of the telephone, to bring in his new creation called the metal detector. Graham Bell was pretty passionate about this creation. It worked really well. That's great. Maybe we can put it over Garfield and find this bullet and get it out, because it's really what's killing him right now. They bring the metal detector, they're using it on Garfield, and it's not working. It's beeping all over him. Like, it's not even working, Alexander Graham Bell. What kind of creation is this? Well, to put it simply, it was working. But the bed that James Garfield was on was full of bed springs, which are made of metal. That's why the metal detector didn't work. Yeah, that's a dumb part of history, but it's kind of fun to look back and say, are you serious, dude? But after the metal detector flop, they're like, man, Garfield, I'm so sorry. It's the middle of the summer. We're in D.C. It's so hot. I wish we could cool you down. To try and comfort him, inventors rigged up one of the earliest forms of air conditioning, a system using ice and fans. But the system was so noisy that they had to shut it off frequently. For 80 long days, while inventors tried their best, Garfield lingered right between life and death. And at the time, the American people really were scared about Garfield. Unlike Guiteau, a lot of America really did like James Garfield. That's how he became president. He was extremely kind, he had great charisma, and he was overall a pretty good speaker, so he was really liked, and Americans were worried about him. So it became kind of a fad to go check the newspaper every morning. Man, I love reading my New York Times about my dying president. They kept going. But here's the thing. The news, just like today on certain platforms, the news was lying. They kept saying, these professional doctors, they kept stating that Garfield is getting better. Garfield is slowly improving. They were so exaggerated, it wasn't even funny. They were stating that he was getting better when he wasn't. He was actually worsening as we speak. And behind the scenes, nobody knew really for certain who was running the country. Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, stayed quiet. He was waiting and he was worrying about what would happen if Garfield dies. And as I was researching this episode, I was reading a book by C.W. Goodyear on Garfield's assassination, and he gave a great analogy for this time where Garfield was pretty much doing nothing, just getting worse. He made the example that the country at that time was kind of like riding a bicycle, and the rider suddenly disappears. The bike, it might keep rolling for a little while, and it looks like it's going to keep going, but eventually it'll fall. That's how America felt in the summer of 1881, riderless. They were uncertain, and they didn't know what was coming next. On September 19th, after 80 painful days, James Garfield finally passed away at just 49 years old. He died as peacefully as he really could have, and that's about as much comfort as anyone could find. Garfield's death changed the presidency completely. And medicine. I hope your doctor doesn't stick his dirty fingers in your wounds now. Garfield changed history. His doctor's mistakes led to an outrage that pushed American medicine towards modern sterilization and hygiene. Thank the Lord. That spoils system I was talking about that set the stage for Guiteau's anger that ended with him shooting, ended with a Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, ending that corrupt practice that had plagued the U.S. government kind of since our beginning. But out of all these things that have changed, Garfield's assassination showed us something about America itself. For the first time, people realized how close and personal they had become with their presidents, how much access they had, and how that very privilege could turn dangerous. After Garfield's assassination, the Secret Service began to take a much more active role in protecting the president. Did they succeed 100% of the time? No, stay tuned for next week. And the open accessibility that Americans had slowly disappeared. Garfield was an amazing man. He was brilliant, he was kind, and he was humble in pretty much everything he did. His story reminds us how fragile leadership and overall life can be. He was an honest man caught in a tragic time, gone way too soon. And James Garfield still today remains as one of America's greatest what-ifs. And what if medicine had advanced just a few years earlier? And what if a madman hadn't changed the course of history? James Garfield is a man with a ton of questions surrounding him. But one answer remains true. He was a great American, gone way too soon. And that is what makes James A. Garfield so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about William McKinley, the 25th president, our last president to fight in the Civil War, a man who was shot by another guy who, I'm going to be honest, I can't even pronounce his name. What makes William McKinley so important, and why does he have our third spot in the spooky month of presidential assassinations? Learn about him and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow Presidents Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.